Italy, one of NATO's lowest military spenders, has found a $16 billion loophole to hit President Trump's 5% defense spending target. The idea is to build a bridge from Sicily to the Italian mainland and classify it as NATO spending. But is this the right approach? And will it set a precedent for other countries to follow? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, plans to build a bridge connecting Sicily with mainland Italy have been in the works since the days of Mussolini. And it's actually a vision which dates back to Roman times. Now, Giorgia Meloni wants to make this dream a reality by categorizing the billion-dollar project as NATO spending. So, will her plan work? And what economic and defence benefit will it actually bring to Italy?
An artist's impression of Italy's bold move to meet NATO's 5% GDP target. Rome wants to revive an old Roman dream, a bridge connecting Sicily to mainland Italy across the Strait of Messina. If built, its 3.6-kilometre span would be the longest suspension bridge in the world and cost an estimated $16 billion. The Italian government argues it will enhance military mobility, enabling NATO forces to move troops and heavy equipment swiftly across the strait. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni says the project is a way to meet the 5% NATO target, which Italy may struggle to do otherwise. Italy is one of NATO's lowest military spenders, paying out only 1.5% of GDP on defence last year. Meloni may be signalling loyalty to her political ally Donald Trump, who championed the 5% target. For now, the bridge remains just a plan, and no formal decision has been made on classifying it as a defence project. But would Trump and NATO accept this as a genuine military investment?
Let's bring in our guests. I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio we have Nina dos Santos. She's a journalist and broadcaster. In London, we have Lorenzo Codogno. He is visiting professor at LSE and formerly chief economist at the Italian Treasury. And in Washington, D.C., in the United States, Michael Ryan, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Nina, to you, you worked for many years in Italy as a foreign correspondent. This story pops up. Everyone from Berlusconi to Mussolini has wanted to implement this project.
And apparently the Romans before that. So this is the ultimate sort of grand ambition, infrastructure-wise, that hasn't yet been realised. And you're right, I did cover it under Silvio Berlusconi, the late charismatic and controversial Italian Prime Minister's time, when he revived this plan to try and build this bridge across the Strait of Messina to link Sicily with the region of Calabria, on the sort of toe of Italy, if you like. Now, those who claim that this project is necessary say that despite all of the difficulties, it's in a seismic zone, it's in a part of Italy that traditionally has issues with corruption, they say this would unlock the economic potential of the south of Italy. And also what it would do is it would stop the brain drain from southern parts of Italy towards the north and help to stabilise the economy. It could also be rather politically expedient as well for the far right in Italy. And they appear to, this time, they think, under Giorgia Meloni, who, by the way, is a protege of Silvio Berlusconi in years gone by, they think they've found the ultimate excuse to try and pay for it. And that means shoving it into the NATO budget this time. So it may well come to pass.
Keeping President Trump happy. Let's bring in Lorenzo. Lorenzo, to you, how likely is this to happen? Is this fantastical, wishful thinking by Meloni, or do you really think it might finally be done?
Well, first of all, I think Nina presented a very clear and comprehensive picture, although I doubt that she is old enough to remember all the iterations of this project. But anyway, I think this is a recurring project that comes back and forward, and in the past it was put aside for various reasons. Maybe over time, and the technology has improved, and therefore it makes sense now to do what in the past was not feasible or not desirable. Having said that, I haven't seen any convincing cost-benefit analysis or impact assessment that justifies that. Now, having said that, clearly it's not just about economics. It might have also other desirable objectives, such as reunite the country and connecting people from Sicily to the rest of the continent. So again, it's difficult to see what could happen. But according to the government, works should start pretty soon. Clearly, it's a long-term project. It will take probably 10 years to complete, but probably the first steps will be implemented pretty soon.
Mike, to you, Italy wants to file this under NATO spending to get their push towards 5% to keep President Trump happy. I'm sure when defense chiefs sit down and look at who's spending on defense, they're thinking of aircraft, tanks, men, weapons. They're not thinking about infrastructure like bridges, surely.
Well, that's exactly right. And it's an unfortunate truth. So the 5% has two buckets. One is 3.5% for aircraft and ships and tanks and things like that. It has another 1.5% for security spending that supports military maneuver and military operations. And in that 1.5%, that's where Italy hopes to push the bridge. And it depends on the context. NATO defends in a 360-degree approach around the entire European continent. So we can't think of the bridge in the context of Ukraine. We have to think of the bridge in the context of other potential contingencies that may arise over time and how this may contribute to NATO succeeding in those other contingencies.
And Mike, how do you think leaders like President Trump will feel then if other countries start copying the Italian approach and putting in bits of infrastructure and claiming it as defense spend? This is not what he wants.
Well, again, 3.5% on defense, 1.5% on national security that supports military operations. These opportunities are debated hotly at NATO, and they go through a staffing process and they go through a defense planning process and they get prioritized. So a nation that wants to claim it, of course, it's completely up to them, but they're going to have to explain themselves to the defense planners and have to do a cost-benefit analysis, as was mentioned, as to what other priorities would have been better served by this money. They can make an argument, and perhaps that argument will carry the day. But ultimately, the decision lies in Rome as how they're going to allocate that 1.5% of their spending to security.
Nina, do you get the impression that this might actually now happen because of President Trump and the push for 5% of GDP being spent on defense?
Well, I think it's closer than it has been in previous iterations. Certainly, I remember when Silvio Berlusconi tried to revive this project. The last time it had been talked about was Mussolini's time. Everybody sort of shrugged it off as a bit of a grandiose scheme that was unlikely to come to pass, largely just because of the technological difficulties. This is a seismic area. It's also an area where, as I mentioned before, in terms of business transparency and so on and so forth, these are footholds of organised crime in Italy. And during those days, those are real hot-button issues. But some of those issues have come off the boil. There have been technological advances. And Italy is also trying to push the argument that there's a lot of significant, particularly US military bases on Italian soil, including one of them in Sigonella, which is in the eastern part of Italy. And a bridge like this, linking Sicily with the mainland, would allow military material to be moved if, say, for instance, there was a skirmish, NATO's borders were breached, and, reinforcements needed to be moved from one part of the Mediterranean to the other. So that's essentially the argument that they're making. There is a flaw with that argument for the moment, and that is that actually when it comes to the mobilization area of military material that NATO recognises, that doesn't at the moment include the island of Sicily. It stops more or less on the boot of Italy.
Lorenzo, do Italians care about something like this? I mean, most people, when I speak to them in Italy, have the same gripes as people in England, Ireland, France: cost of living, lack of housing. A big grandiose project like this, does the average Italian really want this?
Probably not, okay, unless you make a very strong case in favor of it, which I haven't seen so far. But the same is true for defense and military spending. So I think the government, the Italian government, but I would say any government, should make a clear case that military spending, defense spending, is absolutely essential today, as well as some infrastructures that might be perceived as strategic for the country and have some cost benefit. The cost benefit analysis is positive, meaning that there will be some benefits in the future that exceed the cost that the government will incur over the next 10 years. So I think overall, there is a case here for explaining and making public the analysis so that in a democratic way, people can actually back you in government when you make such a decision.
Mike, to you, the Italians are one of the lowest spenders in NATO, 1.49% of GDP last year. I mean, they need to do something, don't they, to get moving if they're to keep President Trump happy?
Well, yes, they do, absolutely. And again, their target for military spending, 3.5%, another 1.5% on security spending. The unknown fact about the Italians is they deploy more forces from their military around the world in operations than any other country except the United States. So they're very active, they're very credible, but they do need to spend more.
And just tell me, how do they feel in the United States then when they see these kind of figures? You know, we've seen some leaked messages from people very close to President Trump referring to European freeloaders in terms of security. Italy is surely one of these countries they're referring to.
Well, they would definitely be referring to Italy in this case. But we have to drill down a little bit deeper because there's burden sharing. As was mentioned, the U.S. has a base at Sigonella. We have bases in Naples. There are NATO headquarters in Naples. We have an air base in Aviano in northern Italy. And so when we took a look at sharing the burden, there's a lot of costs of supporting that burden that have not been added into that defense spending or security spending in Italy. And I think what you'll see over the next year is those sorts of costs will be captured and we'll get a truer picture of what the actual total burden Italy is carrying going forward in the NATO alliance.
Thanks, Mike. Nina, to you, talk to me about Giorgia Meloni, because I've often thought that for any major infrastructure project to get from start to finish, you need a forceful political leader who's really invested in that project. I mean, if she puts her weight behind this, she could actually carry it off.
It's not just her. There's three of them at play here. So it's Giorgia Meloni, who's a protege of, as I said, the late Silvio Berlusconi, who tried to revive this project, but also, crucially, her two deputy prime ministers. One of them is the foreign minister, Antonio Tajani, another crucial ex-Berlusconi member of government in his days, who was also, heavily involved in the first initiative to try and spearhead this project, and Matteo Salvini, who is the leader of the far-right League, which, remember, is originally a northern Italian secessionist movement, but he views this particular project as his opportunity to try and also, muster a lot more support in the south of Italy. That's something that Silvio Berlusconi himself, I remember, tried to do back in his term. So it's not just Meloni, it is other like-minded politicians who are part of a sort of coalition who are also forming this sort of tripartite attempt to try and push this through, which, given, as we just discussed before, the fact that there might be some reason to put it on the NATO budget, that could help, with a war-weary Italian population that's getting quite fatigued by the war in Ukraine. Perhaps this might just move the needle, the fact that you now have all three of them reviving the project together under these considerations.
Lorenzo, just talk to me about Meloni. Has she got the kind of power and the money behind her to achieve this?
Well, the power, for sure, the government is pretty strong right now, also because the opposition is in disarray and it's not certainly posing a serious and credible challenge for the next elections, at least so far. But in terms of spending, clearly Italy has a problem with the high debt to GDP. That's why it is also struggling to achieve the NATO target on defense and security. Having said that, I think probably not yet in the population, but certainly in government, there is a very good understanding right now. I would say this is true throughout Europe, that Europe needs to spend more to defend itself and has also to develop technologies and military capabilities in order to also be more independent from the United States, because clearly we have seen recently the risk that the US might disengage in some way from the area of conflict, which is close to the Ukrainian border. And so I think going forward, I think it would be desirable to keep a strong alliance with the US, but we cannot rely 100% on the US to support our defense. So I think Europe needs to spend more on defense and security. And Italy, there is a good understanding in Italy as well, again, at the government level, not sure about the population. But that is a must in my view. So you need to make room in the budget and within the public finance constraints, because the alternative would be much more costly, because in case of conflict, that would be massively expensive and disruptive.
Mike, President Trump really has sharpened minds in Europe, hasn't he, in terms of defense spending and people starting to pull their weight? I mean, whatever anyone in Europe thinks of Trump, he has got leaders dancing to his tune.
Well, yes, it's all about context, and the context now and the drive by President Trump go together. The war in Ukraine has brought the reality home to Europe that they need to spend on defense, that they need to spend on defending their own interests and not rely solely on the United States. And that's all to the good. But recall, every president in America since President Eisenhower has been completely frustrated by the Europeans' inability to pay for their own defense. And so we finally see an American president, together with the context, which was created by President Putin, are really driving Europe to be what Europe has always wanted to be, and that's an equal pillar of the transatlantic relationship and be able to act on their own. And so it's a good thing.
We know he's a great communicator, Mike, but this message has certainly crossed the Atlantic and landed in various different European capitals, hasn't it?
Well, it surely has. And it's either intentional by President Trump to withdraw support from Ukraine and make the Europeans pay for it, or, which I think is more likely, he's very focused on China. His whole team at the Pentagon is highly focused on the Indo-Pacific region as really the greatest current challenge to American interests. And to be able to put the force of America towards that challenge, we really need Europe to step up and deal with the issues in its own neighborhood. And that includes Ukraine, the Western Balkans, illegal immigration from the South even. And so Europe really needs to step up, and they realize that. And it's good for European politicians to have a foil to push back against, like President Trump, so that they can get their people on board and say, do you want President Trump to tell us what to do, or do you want to do it yourself? And it's a good political argument as well.
Thanks, Mike. Nina, talk to me about the people of Sicily. So it's one of Italy's poorest regions. Would they rather not have all that money spent on better hospitals, more job prospects, less potholes, a better standard of living?
This is the crucial point that Lorenzo was making before. You know, you have to see some effective cost-benefit analysis here, to figure out whether or not there's an opportunity cost in spending 13.5 billion euros on this project rather than spending it on, better education. Creaking healthcare, by the way. Healthcare is a real problem in that part of Italy. And also just efforts to try and deal with waves of illegal migration that comes through the island of Lampedusa in the south of Italy. That, by the way, is also a potential weakness with regards to a bridge that could potentially, be a direct link to the mainland and further towards the north of Europe. You can imagine that some of the EU countries will be looking at this project and sort of thinking, this could spur migration in the future. But yes, there's a big debate that has to be had. Probably my instinct is that it won't be had very forcefully, that perhaps this money could be better spent on trying to beef up services in Sicily rather than making a bridge to the mainland. But, other people will say, who will contradict that argument, will say, well, over successive governments and generations, there's been very little done to try and help Sicily. And even when money has been spent, in some cases it's gone awry, transparency hasn't been forthcoming. And so maybe this is now the time to do this.
Lorenzo, there's no doubt this bridge, if it were to happen, would be an incredible legacy for Giorgia Meloni. How do Sicilians feel about this project? Because, as we say, even Mussolini wanted to do this. But Do Sicilians really care about being connected to Calabria when there's ferries several times a day?
Well, this is a good point. You wonder whether this is really a priority for the Italian economy and policy making. But having said that, again, I have an open mind. I don't claim I'm an expert on cost-benefit analysis. Maybe there are benefits that we don't know or we don't kind of are able to kind of foresee for the future. So it's well possible that connecting the island with the continent might actually increase trade, might actually increase the flows of people and goods, and that would be for the benefit of Sicily. On top of that, clearly there would be an advantage in the building process because that would increase employment and would increase work for construction companies, and there would be a side effect. But again, that's a temporary boost to demand and not a good support for supply. But over time, the supply side effect might actually become significant and therefore help the economies of Sicily and the rest of Italy.
And Lorenzo, can I just ask, you're a money man, you understand economics. You'll be very familiar with the high-speed rail project, HS2, in the United Kingdom. The budget, when that was initially announced, it ended up doubling, then it ended up trebling. Have you faith that those numbers we're seeing in Italy, that bridge could actually be built for 13.5 billion euros?
That's a very good point, and certainly Italy doesn't have a good track record in keeping expenses under check. But I think the good news is that this is a single project, and it's not hundreds of smaller projects that are difficult to track and control. So I would expect the government and technical bodies to have a very strong control on this project going forward, and making sure that the costs do not exceed the projections. But having said that, yes, the risk is there, clearly.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Mike, to you, how concerned would you be if other NATO members started looking at what the Italians are doing and thinking, hang on, we can stick a bridge in here, we can put a road there, we can build some infrastructure here? It's not making Europe any more secure, really, is it?
Well, I can argue that either way. And there's a lot to be said in both cases based on a more global strategic picture of what NATO might need to do in the future. Because long-term projects have to be started before you realize there's a challenge. And so that's a conundrum. When it comes to this type of security spending to support military operations, we used to do it in the Cold War. So they're very refined procedures at NATO. For example, if you drive across a bridge in Germany, in many places, you'll still see a sign that has a little tank picture on it with a weight limit. That's infrastructure that was built not out of defense spending, but out of infrastructure spending, but to support military operations. And so the goal here is to get all allies, when they build infrastructure projects, to build them to a military standard so that in case of wartime, they can be used to move troops more rapidly and move forces more quickly to the places they need to be anywhere in Europe. And that's the thought process that we have to go through on this bridge as well.
Are you surprised, Mike, that the Italians have found a way to kind of, typically Italians, circumvent the laws and the rules, or, just a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for, Lorenzo? Furbissimo, thinking outside the box, just being a little bit fiendishly clever to make things work in your favor. Are you surprised that the Italians have hit upon this idea, Mike?
Well, I wouldn't just leave it to the Italians to think that way. Everyone gets creative when it comes to spending. We have to remember that this spending is not in the NATO budget. It's to meet a NATO target of 1.5% of the 5% spent on security. As I said, it has to go through a lot of argumentation and a lot of planning and a lot of detailed discussion at NATO. And that will, whether it's a good idea, will come out in the wash. And if it's not such a good idea, there'll be a lot of peer pressure on on Italy. That will be a great example for all the other allies not to try such a thing if it doesn't pan out to be a good idea in the NATO context.
Thanks, Mike. Nina, just looking at Meloni, this would be an extraordinary legacy to leave as a politician, wouldn't it? I mean, she would cement her place in Italian history forever if she delivers this bridge.
First of all, I'm going to give you the word you're looking for. It's called la furbizia,
Furbizia.
which means being canny, clever, you know, and as you said, creative, to make things work out for you. And Giorgia Meloni herself is the ultimate furba politician. She's very, very clever, very, very able, and very, very adept. But even though, as you said, this could end up cementing her legacy, pun very much intended, because it will use a heck of a lot of cement, which, by the way, is something that Sicily actually makes in large quantities, it probably will end up being called the Berlusconi Bridge. At the end of the day, these politicians are putting forward the possibility of, if it does come to pass, actually naming it after their grand, you know, political advisor, the person who took them under their wing. They were the protégés of Silvio Berlusconi, and in many ways, many Italians will not view this just as Giorgia Meloni's big project. It is the big project of people like Berlusconi, and also in more difficult chapters of Italy's history, when war was real on this continent, a project that Mussolini had envisioned, and also a footprint that the Romans wanted to bring to Europe and themselves weren't able to do. So it's very much a big part of the Italian historical legacy, but thus far it has never come to pass. And it's unlikely, though, I think it's going to be called the Bunker Bridge, let's be honest.
Lorenzo, grazie mille, and to Mike as well in Washington, D.C., and Nina Dos Santos here in the studio with me. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.